Anthropic released yet another blog, and this time they're introducing a new prompting technique which can substantially improve your LLM agent's performance. They call this technique the think tool, where your LLM agent can decide when to stop and think in complex tool use situations. We have previously seen multiple prompting techniques such as thinking step by step or adding a simple word wait in the LLM output to make it think for longer during inference time. And this is yet another clever way of making LLM think longer. What is different from prior prompting techniques is that in this the LLM itself can choose when to stop and think instead of developers specifying where to think, whether in the beginning using the thinking step by step or by adding the token wait in between the LLM output. If you're new here, my name is Anubhav. I am an applied scientist at Amazon, and on this channel, I share news about the latest ML trends and techniques, the life of a research scientist, and many more topics. So if you're someone interested in these techniques, make sure to subscribe. So if you see about the latest blog, Engineering at Anthropic, the Think tool, enabling Claude to stop and think in complex tool use situations, what they mention is that we have discovered a particularly effective approach, a thinking tool that creates a dedicated space for structured thinking during the complex tasks. They also mention how this is different from the extended thinking capability, which is basically the reasoning capabilities that nowadays the large language models have, such as O1 Mini or Claude 3.7. They further define what is the thinking tool. With thinking tool, you are able to give the Claude the ability to think additional thinking steps, complete with its own designated space as part of getting its final answer. While it sounds very similar to extended thinking, it is a different concept. In case of extended thinking, the Claude is supposed to think prior to actually start generating the tokens, in which case, while generating the outputs, it has to first create the plan and then proceed with the final output generation. Whereas with the think tool, it can even stop and think in between while generating the output. That is what the blog also talks about. With extended thinking, Claude deeply considers and iterates on its plan before taking the action. The think tool is for Claude once it starts generating a response, to add a step to stop and think about whether it has all the information it needs to move forward. This is particularly helpful when performing long chains of tool calls in a long multi-step conversation with the user. So what they are essentially saying is that this is a particularly helpful tool in cases where there are multi-step executions, so that the agent can actually stop in between the execution, consolidate its output so far, and then move forward. So thinking in between actually helps with making a much more reliable execution. This think tool is suitable for cases where Claude does not have all the information needed to formulate its response from the user query alone, and where it needs to process external information such as tool call results. So let's say if the initial user query itself is very ambiguous and they haven't given the complete information, but as and when the agent proceeds further, it can then actually consolidate these information from the user or from the tools that are providing these information. That is where this is particularly helpful. What they further say is that the think tool is better suited for when Claude needs to call complex tools where multiple tools are required, analyzing these tool outputs carefully in between, as well as when there is a policy heavy environment, in which case there is a complete documentation or policies which needs to be adhered carefully while executing the task. They showcase how they introduce this think tool into the agent as a prompt using the Tau bench, in which they have introduced this and given the description as use the tool to think about something. It will not obtain new information or change the database, but just append the thought to the log. Use it when complex reasoning or some cache memory is needed. Then they define the input schema, in which they have the thought as a variable in which you are going to give some thought. So essentially what you are saying is you are providing this agent a tool which it can call with a particular thought. What is the thought on which it needs to think about, and then once you give this to the LLM as an output, it will actually generate its own thought or reasoning around what should be done next. So this is just a very clever prompting technique where you have appended this tool into the prompt, and now it is able to leverage it, use it, and then actually generates the token to think about what it needs to do next. They evaluated the performance of Claude using this technique using the Tau bench on particularly two domains, which is the airline domain and the retail domain. And what they show is that the airline domain particularly saw a increase of 54% relative improvement using just this prompting technique. Their earlier performance was 37, whereas with this technique it was at 57%. And as you can see from the graph legend as well, the baseline technique is where you don't use any of the prompting techniques or extended thinking techniques. Think is when you just use this prompting technique of thinking as a tool. Extended thinking is their reasoning capabilities, where the Claude 3.7 is able to think before generating the final response. And think plus prompt is an optimized version of thinking, where you actually show the example examples and I will just show you that in a bit. So what they are claiming over here is that think plus optimized prompt is actually the best performing model, and it is substantially above the baseline models. Even using a simple think as a tool itself is much better than a simple baseline. Now, what is that optimized prompt that the think tool is used? So what they essentially say is that the best performance of airline domain was achieved by pairing the think tool with an optimized prompt that gives the examples of the type of reasoning approaches to use when analyzing the customer request. So what they are essentially saying is not just by adding the tool description, but rather also telling the model what it needs to think about in those domains when it is actually thinking will help the model in performing much better. So what they define is use the thinking tool in the following way. Before taking any action, respond to the user after receiving tool results. Use think tool as a scratchpad to list the specific rules that apply to the current request, check if all the required information is collected, verify the planned action complies with all policies, iterate over tool results for correctness. And they further give certain examples of how this should be solved. And what this does is it actually tells the model how it should leverage that thinking tool and then go about doing a structured thinking when that tool is invoked. And this is the technique that actually gives it the best performing improvement over the Tao benchmark. They also show that on the retail task also tool plus no prompting actually performed better than extended thinking or the baseline. They also released the think tool description that they used for SWE bench, which is basically a benchmark for software engineering tasks, and they showcase that this actually helped them achieve a new state of the art at 62.3% using Claude 3.7 Sonnet and this thinking as a tool. In the blog, they also specify when to use and not to use thinking tool. They say that you can use thinking tool when tool output analysis is required, when you actually need to analyze the tool's output in between, when there is a policy heavy environment where you have a good documentation which needs to be followed so that the agent can actually stop in between, think about it, see the policy related artifacts and whether it is going in the right direction, and then continue from there. Or there are sequential decision making when each action builds on the previous one and mistakes are very costly. When there is a costly operation, you cannot afford mistakes. It's good to actually have this thinking tool in between. They also say when to not use thinking tool. When there are non-sequential tool calls, if the Claude model only needs to make a single tool call or make multiple parallel calls to complete a task, most likely you will not require a thinking tool because it's a single step atomic operation where it does not need to really think about in the next steps what is going to happen. Or if there is a simple instruction following where the instructions are so simple that you don't really need to introduce a thinking tool and the model itself will do a great job by default. What they also say in the conclusion is that this approach is not just relevant for Claude 3.7, which is their reasoning model, but also is relevant for Claude 3.5 Sonnet, which is a non-reasoning model. But if you use this thinking tool, it will perform far better. Let me know in the comments what you think about this prompting technique and whether you have tried it and how effective it is in your applications. If you like this content, make sure to subscribe to this channel and give me a like. Also share it with your friends and colleagues who you think may find it useful for their particular task. Until next time, this is Anubhav. Bye-bye.